Dad, that waitress looks like Mom. Millionaire father turns around and is shocked. His wife was supposed to be dead. Hello, my beautiful and loyal family. I hope this message finds you all wrapped in warmth and peace. Before we dive into today's heartwarming story, let me start with a prayer that I send to all of you. May your hearts be filled with joy. May your paths be lit with love, and may every step you take bring you closer to the happiness you deserve. Amen. Now, my dear family, thank you for joining me today. As always, I am so grateful for each and every one of you. I am Alcott Bryan, your storyteller, and I invite you to stay with me till the very end of this gripping tale. Today, we're about to embark on a journey of love, betrayal, and heart-stopping twists. Picture this: a self-made millionaire who believes in loyalty above all, a humble woman who faces the darkest of challenges, and a child whose life is about to be turned upside down. But there's one secret that will shake their world, a secret so deep, so twisted, that it will change everything they thought they knew. Will love truly conquer all, or will vengeance steal their happiness forever? Trust me, you won't want to miss a moment of this story. So, sit back, relax, and let's journey together. Watch till the very end, my friends, because the truth, when it's finally revealed, will leave you breathless. Daniel Grayson was not the kind of man the world expected a millionaire to be. At just 32, he had built an empire of success from nothing but his mind, his morals, and his merciless work ethic. With sharply defined features, deep-set blue eyes, and a stature that turned heads in every boardroom he entered, he had the kind of effortless charm that others tried to buy with money or flaunt with fame. But Daniel had no interest in showing off. In a world addicted to appearances, he was the anomaly, a man who saw beyond the surface, who looked for soul instead of style, who searched for depth in a generation drowning in glamour. He dressed in simple tailored suits, never once caught in a flashy car or at an overpriced party. And he lived alone in a minimalist penthouse that reflected the clarity of his mind. He was polite, but distant, gentle, but firm. And while many admired him, few ever got close enough to understand him. His past was a story few knew. The orphaned boy who had read books under street lamps, who had taught himself business by studying strangers at train stations, who had once gone hungry but never let himself grow bitter. He didn't just succeed in spite of struggle, he succeeded because of it. That's why, when the world praised beauty, he remained unmoved. He had seen what false smiles could hide, and how pretty faces could carry poisonous hearts. So, when Emily Walsh became his secretary, a woman whose looks could stun, whose walk turned corridors into catwalks, whose icy grey eyes seemed to look through you rather than at you, Daniel remained unmoved. She tried everything: coffee brought without being asked, compliments wrapped in flirtation, perfumes that lingered in his office long after she left, skirts slightly too short, blouses slightly too open, but Daniel saw none of it. Or perhaps, worse for her, he saw all of it, and simply didn't care. She couldn't understand it. How could this man, who had everything, not want her? She had watched men beg for her time, fall over each other for a single glance. Yet the one man she wanted, the one she could never reach, was the one who barely looked up when she spoke. What stung more than rejection was the quiet dignity with which he rejected her. He wasn't rude, just disinterested, like a man politely stepping around a puddle. She hated it. And what burned deeper was that she knew why. It wasn't just that he didn't want her. It was that he respected people who looked nothing like her. She'd seen the way he spoke kindly to the janitor, a middle-aged black man who barely spoke English. She'd overheard him ask the security guard about his daughter's school. She noticed the way his tone softened with the company's African-American receptionist when she shared her poetry. It wasn't just that he wasn't a racist. He admired them. She couldn't explain why it filled her with such resentment. Perhaps it was the threat of being irrelevant to someone who valued something she didn't have: substance. She would scoff under her breath when Daniel complimented someone's integrity or praised hard work. "It's always the same with him," she muttered once. "Character this, morals that. As if the world runs on kindness." But the truth she wouldn't admit was this: she was jealous, not just of his success, but of the peace he wore like armor. She, with all her beauty, felt empty, and he, with all his emotional distance, felt whole. Every morning when she stepped into his office, heels clicking like gunshots, she hoped today would be different. Today, he would notice her. Today, he would smile a little longer. Today, he would ask her to lunch. But every day passed like the last. Daniel buried himself in spreadsheets, plans, calls, and innovation. The world called him a visionary. Emily called him blind. How could he not see what was right in front of him? And yet, Daniel saw everything. He saw through people. He saw their hunger for attention, their desperation for praise, their craving for control. He had seen it all before, in the foster homes, in the streets, in the eyes of people who offered him food just to make themselves feel good. He had made a promise to himself when he was 15 and sleeping under a library stairwell. "I will never love anyone who doesn't love others." That's why, when Emily smiled with that rehearsed grin, he returned it with indifference. When she rolled her eyes at the receptionist, he took mental note. When she once asked if the cleaning guy even speaks English, he felt something in him quietly shut down. To Emily, this job was a ladder. To Daniel, it was a lighthouse. And he wasn't about to let its light be tainted. Still, Emily tried. Still, she failed. And every failure chipped away at her pride until what started as desire turned into obsession. And what began as longing twisted into something darker. She told herself it was love. But love doesn't envy. She told herself it was passion. But passion does not belittle. And beneath her glossy appearance, behind her designer heels and flawless foundation, her heart grew bitter. And bitter hearts, when left unchecked, bloom into dangerous gardens. Daniel, for now, remained unaware of just how deeply Emily's resentment ran. He was focused on his vision, on changing lives, on using his success to create opportunity, not indulgence. He didn't know that one day his quiet refusal would ignite a fire that could burn down everything he had built. For now, he was just a man who believed in the unseen, who searched for light in places others never looked, a man whose destiny was about to collide with a woman who would change everything. Not with beauty, but with soul. It was an ordinary evening, layered in twilight, the kind where the city hums with routine. Headlights blur into golden smears across damp roads, and lives pass each other like shadows, unaware of the sparks they might ignite. Daniel wasn't meant to be there. He wasn't supposed to stop. But a headache throbbed behind his eyes, like a silent rebellion against another 14-hour day. And for once, he surrendered. He pulled into the small coffee shop, tucked between a pharmacy and an aging bookstore. The kind of place time had forgotten, where the espresso machine wheezed like an old saxophone, and the air smelled of cinnamon, ink, and nostalgia. He sat by the window, sipping bitterness from a chipped ceramic cup when his gaze drifted, drawn not by noise or beauty, but by something quieter, something still. Through the glass, through a curtain of falling dusk, he saw her. Maya. The name would come later, but the impression was immediate. A graceful silhouette in a soft sweater, sleeves rolled just enough to show arms that spoke of work, not wealth. She moved between bookshelves with the ease of someone who belonged to every word she touched, her fingers gliding across spines like they were alive. She wasn't classically stunning. She was something deeper, a kind of beauty that couldn't be faked, a light that wasn't worn but radiated. Her skin was a warm, rich brown that seemed to drink in the low bookstore lights and give something back. Her eyes, though. Her eyes were what stole him, deep, unshaken, like wells holding stories no one had earned yet. She laughed gently with an elderly man searching for poetry. She knelt to help a child find a book about stars, and every gesture, every movement whispered kindness. Daniel didn't realize he'd stood up until the barista called after him, but by then he was already crossing the sidewalk, coffee cup forgotten on the table. He stepped into the bookstore, and it smelled of paper and pine wood and something softer, maybe jasmine, and for a moment he just watched her speak to a customer, her voice low and calm, like pages turning in a quiet room. When their eyes met, it wasn't like fireworks. It was like finding a familiar song after years of silence. She blinked, cautious but not cold. "Can I help you find something?" she asked, her tone polite but unreadable. "Maybe," Daniel said, surprised at how dry his throat felt. "Maybe I already found it." Maya tilted her head, skeptical. "We have a lot of lost things here. Which are you looking for? Fiction or truth?" That answer lit something in Daniel, something he thought had long been buried under boardrooms and contracts. "Truth," he said. "I've had enough fiction for a lifetime." She smiled then, not the way people smile at strangers, but the way windows open to let in a breeze. "Well," she said, "truth's on aisle 3, if you're brave enough." It became their joke later. But in that moment, it was a test, and he passed. He followed her into the aisle, the shelves towering around them like cathedrals of forgotten wisdom, and they talked, not about weather or work or trivial pleasantries, but about people, about why some forget how to feel, why the world confuses power with peace, and somewhere between Nietzsche and Toni Morrison, Daniel asked her what kind of people she trusted. Maya didn't hesitate. "I don't trust rich people," she said plainly, not as a challenge, but as truth spoken without apology. "They're too used to taking without asking. Most don't know how to love without control. They forget what it's like to be vulnerable. They forget how to feel." The words should have stung, but instead they landed like keys, unlocking doors Daniel didn't know were closed. He didn't rush to defend himself. He looked at her, truly looked, and said softly, "Then let me prove that not every rich man has forgotten what love means." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was electric, a quiet acknowledgement that something rare had just begun. Maya blinked once, slowly, and it felt like a lifetime passed in that gesture. She nodded, almost imperceptibly. "We'll see," she whispered. They spent hours wandering through the stories of others, Tolstoy, Baldwin, Austen, and in between pages they revealed pieces of themselves. Daniel told her about growing up with no name on a mailbox, about learning how to spot lies in people's eyes, about building a future no one thought he could. Maya told him about her mother, a librarian who used bedtime stories as lullabies, about surviving heartbreak, about choosing softness in a world that demanded armor. When the store lights dimmed and the owner politely hinted at closing, Daniel didn't want to leave. He lingered at the door. "Will you have coffee with me tomorrow?" She considered it, studying him the way someone studies a book before deciding to read it. "Only if you bring a story worth telling," and so he did. Every day after work, Daniel found himself in that bookshop, each visit a page, each conversation a chapter. They never spoke about wealth. He never told her how much he made. And she never asked. What mattered was that he listened. To her thoughts, to her laughter, to the quiet between her words. And she, in turn, listened to his silences. In a world built on noise, they found music in pause. Dinner followed. Walks, stargazing, letters tucked between books. One rainy evening, beneath the amber glow of a bookstore lamp, Maya reached across the table and touched his hand. "You know," she said, "you're not who I thought you'd be." Daniel smiled, tracing her fingers like lines in a novel. "Neither are you." Somewhere in that moment, love arrived. Not loud or dramatic, but steady and real, like roots breaking through soil. They didn't need declarations. They had proof. And even as Daniel's world, his office, his staff, the pressures of empire, pulled at him, he always returned to the bookshop, like a man returns home. Emily noticed, of course. She saw the way he smiled when he got calls in the middle of meetings, the way he checked his watch at 5 as if someone was waiting. And each sign was another splinter in her pride. She followed him once, saw them walking hand in hand, and the look on her face wasn't heartbreak. It was fury. But Daniel didn't see her. He only saw Maya. And Maya, who once didn't trust the rich, was learning how trust grows, not in promises, but in presence. The world around them would twist, darken, scheme. But in that moment, in that chapter, all that mattered was this. For the first time in a long, cold world, Daniel Grayson was no longer alone. Love didn't crash into their lives with thunder or spectacle. It unfolded like the turning of a soft page, a quiet evolution that surprised even them with its certainty. What began as cautious conversations inside dimly lit aisles and laughter tucked between the binding of old books soon became something unshakable. Daniel and Maya's bond bloomed in defiance of everything the world said should divide them. It was the way Maya tilted her head when Daniel spoke of childhood, the way she listened not just to his words, but to the pauses between them. It was the way Daniel began showing up, not just after work, but sometimes in the middle of the day, bringing her favorite tea and asking about her favorite authors. It was their walks through the park as the sun set low, where Maya would talk about dreams and Daniel would silently wonder how he ever survived without her. They were different, yes, different in skin, background, wealth, but that difference only sharpened their respect for one another, like contrast making a painting bolder. Daniel loved the way Maya challenged him, loved the way she didn't flinch at his wealth or coddle his ego. She loved how he looked at her, not like someone to be impressed, but someone to be known. In Maya, Daniel saw not just beauty, but truth. In Daniel, Maya saw not just a rich man, but a man who had scraped his soul against the world and still chose kindness. Their dinners became sacred rituals, home-cooked meals lit by candles and jazz humming low in the background, conversations that moved from philosophy to childhood memories to silent smiles. They'd sit long after the food was gone, fingers laced together, hearts synced in quiet rhythms, sharing moments too soft for the world outside. When Maya laughed, Daniel swore it echoed in places inside him he didn't know existed. When Daniel cried once, just once, over a memory of his mother, Maya held him without question, and he felt safer than he ever had in his marble-tiled penthouse. There were stares in public, of course, whispers from diners, disapproving glances from strangers who couldn't reconcile their love with their prejudice. But Daniel stood beside Maya with unwavering pride, his hand in hers, his posture a silent declaration. This woman is my future. And the more time they spent together, the more their love outgrew the confines of everyday affection. It became a refuge, a rebellion, a vow whispered in every shared glance. Eventually, Daniel knew what he wanted, and the clarity came not with nerves, but with calm, a stillness he had never known. One golden afternoon, beneath the whispering trees, in a secluded garden Maya loved, he knelt without a grand speech or flashy gesture, just a trembling velvet box and eyes that begged, "Let me be your forever." Maya's breath caught, not from surprise, but from the sheer gravity of the moment. She said yes before the box even opened, before the diamond sparkled in the light. Yes, not to the riches, not to the title, but to the soul she had come to cherish. What followed was a whirlwind of preparation, not for show, but celebration. Daniel insisted the wedding be beautiful, not to prove anything to the world, but to honor the woman who had changed his life. He rented a luxury hotel, not for opulence, but to create a space where joy could echo off crystal chandeliers and dance in the air. Invitations were sent, and though Maya hesitated about who to invite from her quiet life, Daniel urged her to dream without apology. "This day," he said, brushing her cheek one evening, "isn't about who watches. It's about who loves." Maya smiled and agreed, but not everyone shared in their joy. Emily, the secretary whose affection for Daniel had curdled into obsession, received her invitation with a smile that never reached her eyes. She read it again and again, as if the name printed beside Daniel's, Maya, was a mistake, a typo, a joke. But it wasn't. It was truth. And truth burned. She watched from the shadows as preparations unfolded, her heart twisting tighter each day. Jealousy was no longer a flicker. It was a wildfire, feeding on every stolen glance between Daniel and Maya, every whispered plan she overheard about flowers, vows, and music. She tried to poison it with sarcasm. "You sure the guests won't get confused?" she said to Daniel once, pretending to joke. "I mean, you two are such opposites." Daniel's look sliced through her pretense. "Yes," he said coldly, "and that's why we fit." It wasn't just rejection, she felt. It was erasure. In her mind, she had built a future where she was the one beside him, the one adored, the one chosen. And now that vision shattered with every step Maya took closer to the altar. The night before the wedding, Emily stared at herself in the mirror for hours, applying makeup with trembling hands, painting a face she no longer recognized. "He'll see me," she whispered to her reflection. "He'll remember who he belongs with." But deep down, she knew he never had. The wedding day arrived like a dream stitched in gold. Guests flowed into the hotel like poetry, dressed in hope, laughter clinking in champagne glasses. Maya was radiant in a gown of ivory silk, her curls crowned with delicate pearls, her smile lit from within. Daniel, in a tailored black suit, looked at her like a man who had found the last missing piece of his life. When they stood beneath the floral arch, hands entwined, hearts thunderous, the world seemed to hush. The vows they spoke weren't rehearsed. They were real, raw, written from the scars and grace of their journey. "I promise to never let the world define our love," Maya whispered. "And I promise," Daniel replied, voice shaking, "to honor the heart that taught mine how to beat." Applause erupted. Tears flowed. Maya's eyes found Daniel's mother's photo tucked inside his jacket pocket, and she whispered a silent prayer of thanks. But in the far back, standing alone in a corner shadowed by the pillars of gold, Emily watched with clenched fists and glassy eyes. Her face wore a mask of politeness, but her mind was a storm. The kiss between Daniel and Maya echoed like thunder in her soul. Something inside her snapped, not with noise, but with a terrifying stillness. As guests danced and laughed into the night, Emily stood by the exit, her champagne untouched, her smile frozen. She had come to see love, but left with rage. And though the world had moved on to cake and music, in one quiet corner, revenge was being born. But Daniel and Maya, wrapped in each other's arms beneath the chandeliers, were lost in a world of their own. One where colour was not a barrier, but a brushstroke in their masterpiece. And for that night, love was louder than everything. As the final dance of their wedding faded into a soft memory, Daniel and Maya walked hand in hand into a future neither of them could have scripted. One filled with laughter echoing down polished hallways, and love blooming in places even pain once ruled. But behind them, like a shadow tethered to the golden glow of their happiness, Emily stood frozen in time, her heels aching from the hours, but her heart hurting far more. She had watched it all, watched Daniel's eyes light up, not for her, but for a woman she had spent years pretending didn't exist. Every clink of a wineglass, every whispered, "They're perfect together," sliced deeper. Her fake smile, a mask she'd mastered over time, began to crack beneath the weight of her envy. And when she returned to her apartment that night, heels abandoned at the door, mascara streaked with silent rage, she stared at her reflection in the mirror, not to fix her makeup, but to study the woman who had lost everything she never truly had. "She took what was mine," Emily whispered, her voice trembling, not with sorrow, but with venom. Days passed, then months, and while the world moved forward, Emily unraveled. In the office, she smiled as she always had, scheduled meetings, prepared Daniel's coffee. But behind every polite nod hid a storm, an obsession growing in silence. Meanwhile, Daniel and Maya bloomed like a spring garden. Their home, once echoing with quiet luxury, now sang with shared breakfasts, spontaneous dancing in the kitchen, and long, sleepy conversations under dimmed lights. Maya became the soul of the house, her books scattered across the furniture, her laughter painting the walls. And then, one day, in a moment Daniel would remember forever, Maya took his hand in the soft morning light and placed it gently over her stomach. "We're not just two anymore," she whispered, tears clinging to her lashes. And Daniel, strong, stoic Daniel, cried like a boy given the universe. The months of her pregnancy unfolded like a dream. Maya radiant, Daniel protective, both of them learning, growing, building a world where love would be the first language their child would ever hear. When the day came, the pain was long, the hours were cruel, but the reward, a baby boy with Daniel's fair skin and Maya's soulful searching eyes, felt like the universe giving back every joy they'd ever been denied. They named him Elijah, a name that meant strength and spirit, and from the moment he cried his first breath, their hearts beat only for him. Daniel held him with awe, whispering promises into his tiny ears. Maya sang to him with lullabies from her childhood, her voice weaving history and hope into every note. But joy has a way of sharpening the bitterness in those who watch from outside. And Emily, who learned of the birth through office whispers and email announcements, felt something inside her fracture permanently. That baby, that boy, wasn't just a symbol of love to her. It was proof that her fantasy was dead, that Daniel had chosen, fully and finally, and that Maya, a woman Emily had never respected, now carried not just his ring, but his future. The bitterness fermented in silence. She smiled when Daniel showed baby pictures. She even brought a gift, a blue teddy bear with a hidden camera stitched inside, a sick little thrill racing through her as she handed it over and watched Maya's fingers accept it with gratitude. Emily's heart was a house filling with smoke, each breath she took inside Daniel's world, choking her with a fire she couldn't put out. She replayed moments obsessively. The first time Daniel had complimented her work, the way he once touched her shoulder in a meeting. The glances she thought meant something. In her mind, they'd had a story interrupted by someone who didn't belong in their chapter. And now, watching from the edges of a life she had never truly been part of, Emily started to plan. Not out of hatred, she told herself, but justice. She watched Maya's social media, traced the baby's age, memorized their routines. Each smile Daniel posted was a dagger. Each picture of Elijah playing in the garden was a reminder of everything she'd lost to someone she saw as undeserving. She began dressing differently, more subtle, more refined. She stayed late in the office, whispering to Daniel about projects while subtly mentioning how tired Maya must be. "I don't know how she does it," she'd say sweetly. "So many women just lose themselves after children." But Daniel, always kind but guarded, never let those comments land. "Maya is more herself now than ever," he said one evening, not noticing how Emily's nails dug into her own palm. At night, Emily couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, imagining what would have happened if Maya hadn't walked into that bookstore. What if Daniel had chosen her instead? What if the world saw her, not Maya, as the woman beside the powerful, compassionate millionaire who valued truth over beauty? In the quiet hours of jealousy, Emily stopped pretending. Her smiles at work turned hollow. Her desk became a shrine of her delusions, photos of office events with Daniel cropped just right, moments she had clung to, believing they were the seeds of something more. But there were no seeds. Only weeds choking her sanity. Meanwhile, Daniel and Maya thrived, unaware. They took Elijah to the zoo, laughed when he learned to clap, cried the first time he said, "Mama." Their love didn't waver. It deepened, rooted now in parenthood, in shared exhaustion and victories. Maya, even in her sleepless nights and stained shirts, glowed with the quiet pride of a woman who had everything she never thought she'd have. Daniel, in turn, became a man of infinite patience, reading bedtime stories even when deadlines loomed, massaging Maya's shoulders as she rocked Elijah to sleep. Their world was messy and magical. But in the corner of that same world, wearing pearls and a permanent smile, Emily watched and waited. Her revenge wasn't a scream. It was a whisper, a slow drip of poison into the edges of their perfect life. And though they danced and lived and loved freely, a storm was quietly gathering beyond their horizon, one that would change everything. The seasons passed like poetry in Daniel and Maya's home, each moment stitched into the tapestry of their shared life. A year that bloomed with Elijah's first steps across sunlit floors, Maya's laughter warming every room, and Daniel's deepening devotion, now split between two hearts he would guard with his life. Mornings began with the smell of fresh coffee, and Elijah babbling nonsense that made both parents erupt in tired joy. Nights ended in quiet gratitude, Elijah asleep between them in their bed, more often than not, Daniel's arm around Maya, whispering things only she would ever hear. Words that stitched invisible armor around her heart. Every picture framed on their walls held 1,000 unspoken blessings. Their life was real, messy, beautiful, and most importantly, built on a foundation of unwavering love. But across town, in a cold apartment that never quite felt like home, Emily sat in silence most nights, her eyes flicking from screen to screen. Daniel's social media, photos of Maya's face reflected in Elijah's, the filtered perfection of a life she believed was stolen from her. "That should have been me," she whispered often. The phrase now etched into her soul like a tattoo no one could see. She replayed every moment she'd once dismissed, every smile Daniel gave Maya, every story he shared about their baby, every time his voice shifted when he said his wife's name. Obsession doesn't arrive like thunder. It creeps in like fog, blurring the line between memory and fantasy, and Emily was now deep within it. She began cataloguing every detail. What Maya wore when they visited Daniel's office, how often Elijah appeared in his arms, how Daniel's eyes sparkled differently now. She wasn't watching anymore. She was studying, planning. Her walls became her mind, covered in printouts, maps of routines, a pinned web of dates and times. Each piece fueled her fury. "She doesn't deserve him," she muttered over tea. Now cold, her lipstick faded like her grasp on reality. Her love for Daniel, once soft and maybe even pure, had curdled into something acidic, something that gnawed at her even when she slept. And she never slept much anymore. Every compliment Daniel gave her at work felt like a breadcrumb leading nowhere. Every glance a ghost of the connection she swore they once had. He didn't see her. Not anymore. Not really. And that made her dangerous. At work, she became impeccable, efficient, the perfect assistant, the kind of woman no one suspects. She'd smile at Maya during office visits, even lean down to kiss Elijah's cheek. But in her mind, those were rehearsals for a performance she was planning, one where Maya disappeared and Daniel finally saw her for who she really was. She started following Maya, once, then twice. Then it became a routine. She memorized Maya's habits, her favorite bakery, where she went when she needed quiet. She saw how Maya waved to the bus driver, how she stopped to pick up dropped toys for other children. And instead of softening Emily's heart, those moments hardened it. "She's pretending," Emily told herself, acting humble, acting kind, but he won't see it until it's too late. One afternoon, she stole Maya's appointment card from Daniel's desk, the name of a pediatrician. She stood outside the clinic for 2 hours just to watch Maya leave, smiling with her son in her arms. Another time, she trailed them to the park and watched from behind a tree as Elijah ran giggling to his mother's open arms. She didn't feel like a stalker. She felt like justice waiting for its moment. In her head, she was rescuing Daniel from a lie, from a woman who wasn't worthy. The lines between right and wrong had blurred so far, they no longer existed. She began having conversations with herself at night, as if Daniel were there. "I know you didn't mean to hurt me," she'd whisper to her pillow, pretending it was his shoulder. "You were confused, but I'm still here. I've always been here." Her world became a script she'd rewritten so many times. She believed it. And in that world, Maya had no place. Her revenge, though, wouldn't be loud. No scandals, no confrontation. That would only push Daniel away. No, she'd make it slow, surgical. She wanted to destroy Maya without leaving fingerprints. One night, she opened her laptop and began searching. Not for violence, for silence, for ways to make someone vanish from a life without drawing attention. She read stories of digital framing, of manipulation, of faked messages, staged phone calls, fabricated truths. Every new thread made her heart race. This wasn't madness, she told herself. This was strategy. A year had passed since the wedding. A year where Daniel and Maya only grew stronger. And now, finally, Emily decided the time had come. She rehearsed scenarios in her head, like plays. Daniel crying in her arms, Maya gone, Elijah calling her Mommy one day. It made her heart flutter in a way love never had. It was darker now, twisted, but in her mind it was inevitable. She'll break, Emily said aloud one night, the words hanging in the stillness. They all do, and when she does, I'll be the one picking up the pieces. Meanwhile, in the soft, warm glow of their home, Maya folded baby clothes and hummed lullabies, unaware that her kindness had become someone's weapon. Daniel read bedtime stories and kissed his wife on the forehead, completely blind to the storm tightening its grip. And Elijah, innocent and joyful, laughed at a dancing cartoon on TV, not knowing that a woman whose smile he once trusted now watched his family from the shadows. The year of joy had done nothing to slow the seed of revenge. In fact, it had watered it, and soon it would bloom. Time was a steady wind brushing against the life Daniel had built, and as 5 quiet, beautiful years drifted by, his world had become a rhythm of warmth and gratitude, Elijah's laughter filling the rooms like sunshine, Maya's voice a melody that soothed the roughest edges of his day, and Daniel himself, a man who now smiled more often than he ever did before he found her. Love lived in their home like a quiet presence that never needed to prove itself. Their son, now 5, had inherited Daniel's curiosity and Maya's soul-deep empathy. He was a light in motion, asking questions, chasing butterflies, drawing crayon sketches of Mommy and Daddy and me, with hearts too big for the paper. And Maya, still full of grace and quiet power, had become the kind of mother other women admired. A woman whose hugs could heal, whose words could anchor even the wildest storm. But some storms were born in silence. Some began with a whisper in the dark. On a grey Tuesday that had started like any other, Daniel sat at his desk, buried in files, schedules, and silent thoughts of getting home before sunset to surprise Maya and Elijah with takeout from their favourite Thai place. Emily, polished and unreadable as always, sat outside his door, answering calls with a voice trained to show no feeling. That's when the phone rang. A number she didn't recognize. She hesitated, then picked up. The voice on the other end was heavy, uncertain, soaked in something broken. "Hello. I found a woman. A black woman. There's been an accident. She didn't make it. I found her phone. Your number was saved as Sweet Husband. I thought you should know." Emily froze. For a second, the world around her vanished. The words played again and again in her head, like a hymn to vengeance. Her fingers clenched the receiver so tightly, her knuckles paled. Then she transferred the call. "Daniel," she said, her voice coldly composed. "You need to take this." The moment he picked up, the world cracked. Daniel's voice, firm and calm seconds ago, was suddenly laced with fear as he said, "Hello." The man on the other line repeated what he'd told Emily. Each word landed like a blade. Daniel stood up too fast, knocking over his chair, his breath shallow, his heart slamming against his ribs. Where is she? Tell me the place." The caller gave the location. Without another word, Daniel sprinted past a wide-eyed Emily, who watched him go with a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. The drive was a blur of red lights he didn't stop for, horns he didn't hear, memories clawing at him like ghosts. His hands trembled on the steering wheel. Please, let it not be her. Please let this be a mistake, he whispered, like a prayer he wasn't sure who to send to. When he arrived, chaos greeted him. Blinking lights, sirens, a crowd, whispers, flashing phones. The car, the one she always drove when she needed air, was crushed, tilted at an unnatural angle, smoke still coiling upward like the last breath of a nightmare. He pushed through people, shouting her name. "Maya! Maya!" Someone grabbed his arm. A paramedic. "Sir, I'm sorry. She's gone." His knees buckled. The world muted. The sound around him became a ringing echo. He fell to the pavement, hands gripping his hair, mouth open in a silent scream. Time shattered. His heart, once full, was now an endless hollow. They let him see her. The white sheet didn't stop the truth. It was her, Maya. His Maya. Her skin pale, lips parted like she had one more sentence to say, but didn't get the chance. He dropped beside her, kissed her cold forehead, and wept like a man who had lost his soul. The burial came days later. It rained. The kind of rain that seemed like it was mourning with him. Elijah stood clutching his father's hand, confusion and sorrow tangled in his tiny face. "Please bring Mommy back," he kept saying, over and over, as if saying it enough could make it true. Daniel couldn't answer. His own grief had stolen every word. The casket lowered. The soil covered what was left of joy. Friends offered condolences, hands on shoulders, murmured apologies, but none of it mattered. The only voice Daniel wanted to hear was now silent forever. At night, he'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling while Elijah wept in the next room. Sometimes he crawled into his father's bed and asked again, "Why did she go?" Daniel had no answer. He just held his son tighter and cried in the dark. At the office, he buried himself in work, staying late, avoiding home because the silence there was too loud, too real. Maya's dresses still hung in the closet. Her books still lined the shelves. Her laughter echoed in his memory so loudly it hurt. Emily, meanwhile, watched it all with a calculated grace. She offered coffee. She said all the right things. But inside she felt something bloom. Satisfaction, a wicked rose blooming in the ashes of another woman's life. Elijah stopped smiling. His drawings turned to grey skies and stick figures with broken hearts. He stopped eating his favorite foods. Every day he waited at the door for a miracle. "Maybe Mommy will come back today," he'd say. And Daniel, broken, never corrected him. He let the boy believe, because part of him, deep down, wanted to believe too. But the grave was real. The funeral was real. The tears, they were real. Or so he thought. Until one day, years later, the cracks in that truth would begin to widen. But for now, the house remained a museum of love lost, a sanctuary haunted not by ghosts, but by what-ifs. And the woman who caused it all, she slept peacefully each night, convinced she had won. Daniel buried himself in work, not because he loved it, but because it was the only thing that didn't remind him of her. The only place where her scent didn't linger in the curtains, or her laughter echo in the walls, and the glow of spreadsheets, meetings, and deals became his refuge from the storm that had settled in his chest the day Maya's light went out. He convinced himself that motion was medicine, that if he just kept going, if he just stacked more hours, signed more contracts, handled more pressure, then the aching in his heart would fade like fog. And yet, every night, when the city dimmed and the last email was sent, he returned to a house filled with shadows that used to be her, to a silence so sharp it could split skin, to a son who no longer asked him to play, no longer giggled from the couch, but sat curled like a question mark on the floor of his room, clutching the same photo frame that held her smile behind glass, whispering, "Please, come back, Mommy," with a voice too soft for a boy who used to fill the halls with joy. Daniel heard it sometimes, through the door he didn't have the courage to open. He heard the pleas, the sniffles, the little broken wishes that stabbed deeper than any boardroom negotiation ever could. And yet he didn't know how to fix it, didn't know how to hold his son without breaking into pieces, because his arms were used to holding her too. And now they felt empty in the worst way. Meals turned into silent rituals. Elijah barely touched his food. Daniel drank more coffee than water, and the table where laughter once lived now felt like a museum exhibit to a love gone missing. Photos on the wall showed the life they once had. Maya in the park with Elijah in her lap, Daniel beside them, all smiles and sunshine. But now those pictures hurt, so Daniel avoided looking at them. And when he did, he felt like a stranger in his own story, a survivor who wasn't sure he wanted to be. People stopped by at first, friends who offered casseroles and awkward prayers, but grief made visitors uncomfortable, and eventually they stopped calling, stopped checking in. And Daniel preferred it that way, because grief had become his companion now, quiet and constant, and he didn't want to perform healing for anyone else's comfort. Sometimes he sat on the couch where Maya used to read, just to be near the impression her body left in the cushion, pretending if he closed his eyes long enough he could still smell her lavender oil or hear her humming to Elijah. But every time he opened them, the ghost of that moment vanished, leaving only furniture and dust and heartbreak in its place. Elijah's drawings changed too, no longer colorful animals and rocket ships, but gray skies and stick figures with tears. And once Daniel found a crayon sketch of a gravestone with the words, "Come back, Mommy," scrawled beneath it in crooked letters, and he folded it, placed it in his briefcase, and carried it with him to meetings he couldn't focus on because the world outside kept moving. But his had frozen at the moment he kissed Maya's forehead goodbye. Nights were worst. He'd lie awake listening to the sound of Elijah breathing beside him, the boy having taken to sleeping in his father's bed because the nightmares were too loud, and the silence in his own room too cruel, and Daniel would watch the ceiling and whisper apologies to a woman who could no longer hear them, while Elijah, in his sleep, murmured her name like a prayer that had never stopped being said. Daniel stopped playing the piano. Maya loved his playing, and now it sat in the corner collecting dust like a monument to silence. He wore the same suits over and over, didn't care about new ones, didn't shave unless a meeting forced him to. And at work, though his eyes were sharp and decisions crisp, the soul behind them had gone somewhere distant. Emily watched it all from her glass-walled office, a calculated calm in her eyes as she studied him unravel slowly, day by day. And though she offered sympathetic glances, Daniel never truly looked back. He was too consumed by the weight of absence, too hollowed by grief to recognize anything else. Sometimes he sat on the floor of Maya's closet, surrounded by her scarves, her notebooks, her scent, and read her old journal entries, pages filled with her dreams for their son, her hopes for their future. And he'd press those pages to his face, breathing them in like oxygen, as if they could somehow fill the empty place in him. Elijah began talking less at school. Teachers called with concern. Daniel promised he'd try to talk to him. But how could he help the boy when he himself had no map out of this darkness? They were both wandering in a maze made of memory and missing pieces, and love, once their compass, now felt like a word too fragile to touch. Holidays passed like shadows, no lights, no celebration, just passing days wrapped in routines and silence, and every now and then, when Daniel thought no one could see, he'd look up at the sky and whisper, "Where did you go, Maya? Why did you leave us like this?" Not out of blame, but out of unbearable loss, as if somewhere out there she could hear and answer. And maybe then, just maybe, he'd know how to begin again. 2 years had slipped by like fog through the windows of Daniel's life, slow and quiet and heavy, and while the world moved on with new seasons and smiling strangers, he remained in that internal winter where grief iced over every joy. But something in his son's hollow eyes, in the way Elijah no longer asked for bedtime stories or held crayons like they were magic, made Daniel realize they both needed something different, something far from the shadow of the house that had once been a home. So, one morning in early spring, he packed their bags and booked a spontaneous trip to the mountains, to a place where time felt slower and air smelled like pine and possibility, hoping that maybe, just maybe, distance from the familiar could stir a little warmth back into their frozen hearts. The drive was long but peaceful, winding roads that curled like ribbon through forests and valleys, Elijah's head leaning against the window, watching trees blur into watercolor strokes, occasionally asking questions about clouds and deer and whether the sky was higher in the hills, and Daniel answered with a softness he hadn't used in a while, his voice trying to remember the language of wonder that Maya once taught them both. They arrived at a small lakeside inn, all wood and stone, and soft lighting, and for the first time in forever, the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was thoughtful, shared, something beginning to heal. Days passed in gentle waves, fishing by the water, skipping stones that carried whispered wishes, roasting marshmallows by a crackling fire where Elijah finally laughed again. A laugh so raw and sudden, Daniel had to look twice to believe it was real, and when it was, he felt something in his chest loosen, a thread of grief unraveling just enough to breathe. They hiked under sunlit canopies, played card games in the rain, and ate meals where Elijah didn't push food around, but actually asked for seconds. And Daniel, who once feared he'd never see light in his boy's eyes again, watched with cautious hope as those embers began to glow. On the third day, they ventured higher into the hills to a rustic Mountain View restaurant known for its wild berry pie, and the inside smelled of cinnamon and cedar, and soft jazz played in the background while waiters moved like calm breezes. Daniel was reading the menu aloud to Elijah, asking whether he wanted pancakes or waffles, when suddenly the boy froze mid-sentence, his fork hovering, his wide eyes staring across the room as if he'd seen a ghost. And then he whispered, almost breathless, "Dad, that waitress looks like Mom." And Daniel blinked, heart stalling, unsure if this was another moment of wishful imagining that often haunted children of loss. But when he followed his son's gaze, his own breath caught, because there, across the wooden floor, carrying a tray of drinks with an elegance he thought only one woman had, was someone with the same deep brown eyes, the same gentle stride, the same tilt of the head when she smiled, and for a moment the world shrank to just her, and Daniel felt dizzy, disoriented, caught between logic and longing. He told himself it couldn't be. Maya was gone. He'd buried her, mourned her, carried her ghost like a second skin. But everything in him screamed familiarity, screamed recognition, and Elijah tugged at his sleeve, whispering again, "It's her, Daddy. I know it's her." And Daniel, pulse thudding in his ears, stood slowly, afraid to hope, afraid to move, yet unable to stay still, walking across the room with feet that didn't feel like his own, each step a storm of memory, until he stood just a few feet from the woman who looked up, saw him, and in that moment dropped the tray, glass shattering on the floor, her lips parting in shock, eyes widening, not in confusion, but a recognition. Pure, unmistakable recognition. And as silence fell around them like snowfall, Daniel's voice cracked into a whisper. "Maya?" And her eyes filled instantly, not with fear, but with the kind of ache only love and pain could birth, and before he could say another word, she moved, fast, like breath returning to lungs, wrapped her arms around him with trembling strength, and he held her, stunned, confused, overwhelmed, but not letting go, not this time. And Elijah ran toward them, shouting, "Mummy!" With such desperation, it fractured every heart in earshot, and when Maya dropped to her knees and opened her arms, the boy crashed into her chest like a wave finding shore, both of them sobbing into each other as if time had no right to keep them apart, and all Daniel could do was kneel beside them, his hands on both their backs, tears blurring his sight as reality bent around this impossible reunion, and for the first time in years he allowed himself to believe in miracles, not because he understood how she was alive, but because she was warm, she was real, and her voice, though shaky, whispered against his ear. "I never stopped loving you. I tried to come back." And Daniel, lost in the scent of her hair, whispered back, "Then don't ever leave again." And in that fragile, eternal moment, nothing else mattered. Not the years lost, not the questions waiting, not even the revenge still lurking in the shadows. Because the family he thought had been broken was suddenly, impossibly whole again. Daniel couldn't breathe, not the way he used to, not the easy way people take air for granted, but the kind of breathlessness that comes when your soul recognizes something your mind isn't prepared to accept. And as he knelt beside the woman who looked like the love he'd buried, holding their child who clung to her like a lifeline, everything around him blurred into a distant hum. The clatter of dishes, the murmurs of other diners, the creak of the wooden floor, all drowned by the pounding in his chest, and he stared at her, searching her face for any flaw, any mistake, anything that would tell him this wasn't real. This couldn't be Maya. But instead, all he found were the pieces of her he'd memorized like prayer. The way her lower lashes curled ever so slightly when she cried. The faint dimple on her right cheek that only surfaced when she smiled shyly. The tiny scar near her temple from a childhood fall she once laughed about on their second date. And now, here she was, blinking back tears, touching his face like he was a ghost, and she didn't want to scare him away, and all he could say was her name, not as a question, not as disbelief, but as a fragile hope laced with everything he never got to say at her grave. And she didn't answer immediately. She just leaned her forehead against his and whispered his name, back with a tremble that shattered him. Daniel. Like saying it aloud, hurt, like holding it in had broken something inside her for years. And as their son buried his face into her arms, crying that special cry only a child who believes in impossible love can cry, she closed her eyes and kissed the top of his head with a reverence that defied every logical law of life and death, And then, slowly, like someone peeling back a curtain that had kept her imprisoned for too long, she began to speak. Her voice raw, uneven, the words crawling out like wounded animals, telling him what had happened the night of the so-called accident, how she remembered swerving on the road and a blinding light before everything went black, how she'd woken in a haze, buried alive, her lungs burning as dirt crushed her chest, how she screamed and screamed until a miracle happened, until hands clawed at the soil, until she was pulled from her grave by an old man with tears in his eyes and panic in his voice. "You're alive! Oh God, you're alive!" And how, in that moment of rebirth, she thought she'd been given a second chance, only to realize she was not rescued by a stranger, but by someone who had no intention of returning her to her family, because the man was the father of Emily. Yes, that Emily. And when Maya asked for help, when she begged to call her husband, the man panicked, telling her to stay hidden, saying she wasn't safe, that returning would ruin everything his daughter had built. And before she could resist, before she could run, Emily appeared, dressed in sorrow black and eyes cold as marble, saying the words that froze Maya's soul. "You're dead now. And if you try to return, your son and Daniel won't live long enough to bury you again." And Maya had believed her, terrified not for herself, but for them, for the boy who looked like his father and laughed like her, for the man who had once said love was more than beauty. It was soul, and she couldn't risk it, couldn't test the truth of Emily's threats, so she stayed away, moved far, changed her name, cut her hair, worked odd jobs under the radar, always watching from the shadows, always aching, until this job, this random diner tucked in the hills, this quiet place where she thought the past could never find her. And yet, here he was, her past, her heart, her family, standing before her with eyes full of pain and hope and 1,000 questions she was finally brave enough to answer. And as she spoke, Daniel's world crumbled and rebuilt itself with every sentence, every truth, a punch and a balm, every moment stolen from them returning in flashes, first steps, first words, anniversaries missed, lullabies never sung. And he held her face and said, "You don't ever have to hide again." And Maya sobbed, the sound of a woman who'd lived 1,000 deaths in silence, and their son, oh, their precious boy, looked up at them with a trembling lip and asked the question that broke Daniel's heart wide open. "So, are we a family again?" And Maya nodded with every ounce of strength left in her, whispering, "We never stopped being one." And Daniel stood, pulling both of them into his arms, heart roaring with the thunder of second chances, swearing right then that nothing would tear them apart again. And somewhere in the back of the restaurant, unnoticed, a pair of cold grey eyes watched from behind a napkin-laden booth, hands clenched so tightly the knuckles blanched, lips curled into a sneer that promised, "This isn't over." As the world seemed to swirl around Daniel, the weight of his emotions heavy in his chest, Maya led him into the quiet corner of the mountain restaurant. The dim light barely illuminated her face, but Daniel could see the pain in her eyes, the same eyes that had once been filled with love and hope. Now they were filled with sorrow and a deeper, more terrifying truth. Sitting beside her, he reached out and held her hand, his heart thundering in his ears, yet he couldn't seem to focus on anything except her words, her trembling voice that threatened to shatter him. He knew deep down that there was more to Maya's disappearance than he had ever been told. but nothing could have prepared him for what she was about to reveal. Maya took a long, shaky breath before she spoke, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "When you left me buried, an electric wire ran under my grave," she whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of the past. "A current ran through the earth. It shocked my heart back to life, Daniel. I can still feel the surge of it, the pain, the shock, as it jolted me from the depths of darkness." Her voice wavered as the horror of that moment came back to her. Daniel sat still, his body frozen, unable to comprehend what she was saying. His mind raced, but his heart was already 2 steps ahead, fearing the unimaginable. I screamed, Daniel. I screamed with everything I had left in me, and I thought no one could hear me, that no one could save me. But someone did. Someone heard me. She paused, looking at him with wide eyes, as if searching for the strength to continue. Daniel held his breath, not daring to speak, afraid that any sound would break the fragile moment of revelation. "It was your secretary's father," she finally said, her voice a whisper, almost lost in the space between them. "He was the one who heard me. He came to my grave and pulled me out. He saved me from the earth, from death." Maya's eyes glistened with unshed tears, the horror of those memories clearly haunting her, but it was the next part of her story that sent a chill through Daniel's spine, a chill colder than the mountain air. "But after that, everything changed. I wasn't free, Daniel. I wasn't saved." Daniel's heart skipped a beat, confusion and fear mingling within him. "What do you mean? What changed?" he asked, his voice thick with disbelief. Maya's hand trembled in his as she leaned closer, her breath shallow, as if the weight of her words had become too much to bear. "Emily," she whispered, the name a venom on her tongue. Emily was the one who made this happen. She planned it all. The accident, the lies, the silence. She wanted me gone, Daniel. She wanted me out of your life, out of your heart. Maya's voice was barely above a whisper now, but the truth in her words was undeniable, crashing over him like a tidal wave. "When your secretary's father found me and pulled me from the grave, Emily was the one who told him to keep me hidden. She told him that if I ever came back, if I ever dared to return to you, she would kill you. And she would kill our son, too. She threatened our lives, Daniel." The silence that followed was suffocating. Daniel could barely process what Maya had just said, the enormity of Emily's betrayal hanging in the air like a thick fog. His mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of his past, the years of pain, the time spent believing that he had lost everything. And now, everything he had known was crashing down around him, a lie that had been woven into his life, a twisted game that had been played without him ever knowing the stakes. "Why didn't you come back sooner?" Daniel finally choked out, his voice raw with the confusion and anger boiling inside him. "Why didn't you fight for us?" Maya's face crumpled with grief. She looked down, her tears falling freely now, the weight of her own guilt too much to bear. "I couldn't, Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I couldn't risk your life, or our son's. I thought if I stayed hidden, if I stayed away, I could protect you both. I was terrified. Terrified that if Emily found out I was alive, she would carry out her threats." Daniel's grip on her hand tightened, and for a moment, all the anger, the grief, the years of loneliness, everything came rushing to the surface. "But Maya, you don't understand," he said, his voice strained. "I spent years believing you were gone. I thought I buried you, and I couldn't stop loving you. I never stopped believing in you, Maya. Never. All this time, I've been living a lie." Maya's eyes searched his face, her expression full of apology, full of regret. "I know, Daniel. I know," she said softly. "I'm so sorry. But you have to understand. I did it out of love. I thought I was protecting you, but now I see that all I've done is destroy everything we had. And for that, I'll never forgive myself." Daniel closed his eyes, trying to process the tidal wave of emotions crashing over him. He had lived with the pain of losing Maya for so long, and now that she was back, it felt as though everything had shifted, and he wasn't sure if he could trust anything anymore. But in his heart, he knew one thing for certain. The woman in front of him was the love of his life, the mother of his child, and no matter the years lost, no matter the lies, he couldn't let that go. "I don't care about the past anymore, Maya," Daniel said, his voice firm but filled with vulnerability. "I just want to be with you. I just want to be a family again." Maya's tears fell freely now, her heart breaking with the weight of their shared pain. She reached out, cupping his face with trembling hands. "I want that too, Daniel. But we can't go back to the way things were. We can't erase the past. But we can start over. We can rebuild." And for the first time in years, Daniel allowed himself to believe in the possibility of a future with Maya. He let go of the anger, the guilt, and the fear. Together, they could face whatever came next, because the truth, as painful as it was, had set them free. The air in Daniel's office was thick with tension as he paced back and forth, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. His thoughts churned with fury, disbelief, and the overwhelming need to bring the truth to light. Emily had been a part of his life for so long. He had trusted her, believed in her. But now, the truth about her treachery had been laid bare. Maya's confession, the shocking revelation of her own near-death experience, and the conspiracy behind it, had shattered everything Daniel thought he knew. But it wasn't just Maya's words that would bring Emily to justice. There was proof, hard evidence, that could no longer be ignored. And today, Daniel was ready to confront the woman who had so nearly destroyed his life. In his hands, Daniel held the recordings, hidden, carefully preserved by Maya in the years she had spent in hiding. They were the damning evidence that would unravel Emily's deceit and expose the darkness she had hidden behind her icy, beautiful exterior. Maya had been resourceful, surviving in a world of secrecy, and she had made sure to document every conversation, every threat Emily had made, every moment of the cruelty that she had endured. These recordings were the truth, the final piece of the puzzle. And now it was time to use them. Daniel walked into the meeting room, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure how Emily would react. Would she try to deny everything? Would she lie her way out of it, like she always had? Or would she finally face the consequences of her actions? He had no answers, but one thing was certain. This time, he was ready. Emily sat at the conference table, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her eyes cold and calculating as she glanced up at Daniel. She had no idea what was coming. She smiled, her usual condescending smile that made Daniel's blood boil, but he couldn't let himself be distracted by it now. He needed to stay focused. For Maya, for their son, for everything they had lost, and everything they were about to regain. "Daniel," Emily said, her voice smooth and full of false sweetness. "You look tense. Something wrong?" Daniel stood tall, his jaw clenched, his hands shaking with the intensity of what he was about to do. "You know exactly what's wrong, Emily," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "It's time to stop pretending. Time to stop lying." Emily's smile faltered, and for the first time she looked uncertain. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, though the faint tremor in her voice betrayed her. "I've always been loyal to you, Daniel. I've always done what's best for this company. You know that." Daniel's eyes narrowed as he placed the small recorder on the table. "I know exactly what you've done, Emily, and I have the proof." Emily's eyes widened, her breath catching as she stared at the recorder. What is that?" Her voice wavered, a flicker of fear crossing her face before she quickly masked it with a feigned smile. "This is ridiculous. You're imagining things." "No, Emily," Daniel said, his voice sharp and unwavering. "I'm not imagining things. You can't deny what you've done anymore. You've been planning this for years, haven't you? You've been manipulating everything, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. But the truth is out now. I've heard it with my own ears." He pressed play on the recorder, and the room filled with the harsh, unmistakable sound of Emily's voice, clear and cold, speaking the words that would seal her fate. Daniel listened as Maya's terrified voice echoed through the speakers, pleading with Emily's father to let her go, to not harm her, to protect her family. Emily's voice followed, dripping with venom and threats. "If you ever let her return to him, I'll make sure she and her child disappear for good. And I'll destroy everything she's built. You understand me?" The recording continued with more threats, more vile words that made Daniel's skin crawl. Emily's face drained of color as the truth filled the room. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Her eyes darted around, seeking escape, but there was no way out now. Daniel had her. The woman who had once been his trusted secretary. The woman he had believed was loyal and kind, had been orchestrating his wife's death and keeping her hidden away for years. It was all laid bare before him. Every lie, every manipulation, every twisted scheme. There was no hiding anymore. "You thought you could get away with it, didn't you?" Daniel's voice was low and furious, but there was a sense of finality in it, too. "You thought you could break us apart, destroy everything I loved, and I wouldn't find out. But you were wrong. Maya is alive, and everything you did is exposed." Emily stood up abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor as she backed away from the table. "This is insane," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "You don't understand, Daniel. I did it all for you. I loved you. You were mine. My future. Maya was just a distraction. A fool who didn't deserve you. I was the one who was always there for you, always loyal. I could have given you everything you wanted. But you chose her." Her face twisted in fury, and for the first time, Daniel saw the true extent of her obsession. "I was going to be your wife. She was in my way. And you let her take everything from me." Daniel stepped forward, his eyes locking onto hers with a strength she couldn't match. "You don't get to dictate my life, Emily. You don't get to decide who I love or who deserves to be in my family. What you did, trying to destroy Maya, trying to destroy my son, my family. It's unforgivable." Emily's rage reached a boiling point, her hands trembling as she clenched them into fists. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The truth was out, and the law was already on its way. Before she could lash out again, the door to the office opened, and 2 police officers stepped inside, their presence immediately commanding the room. They had been waiting outside, listening, ready to act as soon as the evidence was presented. Emily's face contorted with fear as the officers approached her. "Emily Johnson, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, attempted manslaughter, and multiple counts of harassment and intimidation," one of the officers said, his voice firm and cold. "No!" Emily screamed, her voice high-pitched with panic. "This is all a lie. You can't do this. You can't arrest me. I'm innocent." But the officers didn't flinch. They moved swiftly, placing her in handcuffs and leading her out of the room, her cries echoing in the halls as she was taken away. As the door slammed shut, Daniel exhaled deeply, his body trembling with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. He had done it. He had exposed the truth. Emily's reign of terror was over, and as he turned to Maya, his heart filled with warmth, he knew that they could finally begin to heal. Together, they could rebuild their family, their life, their future. The truth had come crashing down, but it had set them free. Maya stood at the threshold of their home, her eyes taking in the familiar surroundings, yet they seemed so foreign now. 2 years had passed since her world had shattered, since her life had been stolen from her in the cruelest of ways, buried beneath the weight of a dark plot orchestrated by someone who had once pretended to love her. But now, she was back, stronger, determined, and no longer a victim of her circumstances. As the door creaked open, Daniel's face appeared in the frame, a smile spreading across his lips as if the weight of the past years had finally lifted. Without a word, their son ran to her, his small arms reaching out, and Maya knelt down to catch him in an embrace so warm, so full of love, that it could erase the pain of the past. "Mommy!" the little boy exclaimed, his voice filled with wonder, as if seeing her was the greatest miracle of all. His words, so simple, so innocent, filled the room with a peace Maya hadn't known in what seemed like a lifetime. She hugged him tightly, inhaling the sweet scent of his hair, allowing herself to forget the terror of her years-long separation. She had missed him more than words could ever describe, more than the sun could miss the moon in the darkest of nights. Daniel stood by them, a silent witness to this beautiful moment. His eyes shone with unshed tears, his heart swelling with emotions too powerful to express. He had fought for so long to hold on to his memories of Maya, to believe that she was out there, somewhere, alive, strong, and waiting for their reunion. And now, standing before him, she was real. She was home. She was his wife once more, and their family was whole again. Maya felt the weight of the years they had lost, the years that had been stolen from them by lies and betrayal. But in this moment, as her family surrounded her, that pain began to melt away. She held Daniel's gaze, and for the first time in so long, she didn't feel the need to speak. He was there. She was there. Their son was there. And that was all that mattered. After what felt like a lifetime of silence, Daniel finally stepped forward, his strong arms wrapping around both Maya and their son. The 3 of them stood there together, basking in the warmth of their love. The years of grief, the loss, the separation, it all melted into the past, no longer a part of their future. "We've been through hell, Maya," Daniel whispered, his voice hoarse. "But we've survived, and now we can build something even stronger. Together." Maya nodded, her heart full. She had spent so many nights wondering if she would ever see this moment, wondering if her family would ever be reunited, if the love they shared could ever truly overcome the darkness that had tried to tear them apart. But standing here, with Daniel and their son in her arms, she knew that love wasn't just a fleeting feeling. It was a force. It was the one thing that could never be broken, no matter how hard life tried to tear it down. Days passed, and Maya and Daniel found their rhythm again. Slowly but surely, they began to rebuild what had been lost. Maya, once the humble woman in the bookshop, now found herself back there once more, surrounded by the quiet whispers of books and the smell of paper that had always comforted her. But this time, there was a difference. Daniel and their son would visit her, bringing her lunch, spending time with her as she worked. They were a family, whole and together, reminded every day that no matter what the world had thrown at them, love was the glue that bound them. Maya had spent so many nights lying awake in the darkness, her mind racing with thoughts of revenge, of justice, of everything that had been taken from her. But now all of that had faded. Maya had found something much more precious: her family, her peace, and her strength. The warrior she had become was no longer defined by the pain of the past, but by her ability to love, to forgive, and to move forward. And so they lived, Daniel, Maya, and their son, a family rebuilt from the ashes of betrayal and loss. They had faced darkness, but now they lived in the light. Love had not just survived, it had conquered everything. And as Maya stood at the counter of the bookshop, her son's laughter filling the air, and Daniel's comforting presence always by her side, she knew that the greatest story of all had just begun. Their story wasn't just about survival, it was about triumph. It was about the power of love, the strength of family, and the courage to move forward no matter how impossible the path seemed. And as the final scene faded, Maya, once again the humble bookshop owner, stood not as a victim, but as a warrior. With Daniel and their son always nearby, the life she had dreamed of was finally within her grasp. This time, nothing could take it away.